Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will
Good morning, and welcome back to the American Culturist, the show where we unapologetically celebrate the greatest civilization the world has ever known, the one built on Enlightenment reason, individual liberty, Christian moral foundations, and the conservative conviction that some cultures are simply superior to others because they value truth, beauty, and human flourishing over fanaticism and submission. Today's episode is a big one. In our news segment, we're looking at something historic happening right now across the Atlantic, a political earthquake that the mainstream American media is covering poorly and the conservative media is covering incompletely. Europe is racing rightward at a pace and scale that has no modern precedent, and we're going to examine what's actually driving it, what it means, and what the Western philosophical tradition tells us about people when they finally decide they've had enough. Then we have some genuinely wonderful news from the deep ocean where scientists have just discovered 24 brand new species of life in the Pacific, including an entirely new branch of life that nobody knew existed. In an age of bad news, that's the kind of discovery that should stop us in our tracks with a sense of wonder. And in our main topic, we're going to process the European right wing surge through the lens of Western culturism. What does history tell us about civilizations that lose confidence in themselves? What does the philosophical tradition say about the relationship between a people and their culture? And what should we make of this moment as Americans who share that civilizational inheritance? Stick with me because this one connects more dots than you might expect. Let's start with France because what just happened there this past weekend is both remarkable and instructive. On March 22nd, 2026, France completed the second round of its municipal elections, and the results sent shockwaves through the European political establishment. Marine Le Pen's right wing National Rally Party won votes in dozens of small and mid sized towns across France, with the party leader Jordan Bardella claiming the greatest breakthrough in the party's history. The National Rally has assembled a broad coalition stretching from disaffected working class voters to wealthier middle class conservatives, and it shows no signs of fading. Now, the mainstream media is covering this primarily as a horse race story. Did the far right win or lose? Which cities did they take? What does it mean for the 2027 presidential election? And those are legitimate questions. But they completely missed the more important story, which is the magnitude and the trajectory of what's happening. More than 3,000 National Rally officials were elected in these municipal contests, which will pave the way for the party to make inroads in the upper house of France's parliament later this year. And critically, the more towns the National Rally conquers, the less toxic the party's image becomes. This is how political movements normalize and grow, slowly and then suddenly. And France is just one piece of a much larger picture. Pull back to the continent wide view, and what you'll see is nothing short of a political revolution in slow motion. The alternative for the German party gained 20.8% of the overall vote share and 152 seats in the German Bundestag in the 2025 federal election, making it the second largest party in Germany's parliament. Think about what that means. Germany, the country that has spent 80 years in a state of almost penitential self examination about nationalism, just made a nationalist party its second most powerful political force. Right wing populists are now in government or supporting ruling coalitions in Belgium, Poland, Croatia, Finland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Slovakia, and Sweden. In Portugal, the far right Chega party achieved 22.8% of the vote in the May 2025 legislative election, tying for second place with the Socialists. In Austria, the Freedom Party topped the polls. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni has governed since 2022 and remains very popular. According to a quantitative analysis by The Economist, European right wing parties since 2020 have received 24% of the vote in legislative elections and won 23% of parliamentary seats. 1 in 4 European voters is now choosing parties that the establishment labels far right. That's not a fringe movement, that's a mass political realignment. So, what's driving it? The mainstream left's answer is economic anxiety, inequality, and the manipulative rhetoric of demagogues exploiting people's fears. And while economic factors absolutely play a role, that explanation is both condescending and incomplete. It treats millions of ordinary Europeans as children who are too simple to understand their own motivations and too easily misled to be taken seriously. In February 2025 alone, Europe witnessed a car ramming attack in Munich by a 24-year-old Afghan resident, a knife attack in Villach, Austria by a 23-year-old Syrian refugee, and a stabbing in Mulhouse, France by an Algerian immigrant under a deportation order. These aren't abstractions. These are the lived experiences of people in European cities who have watched their governments prioritize ideological commitment to open borders over the basic safety of their own residents. If there's been a defining issue of European politics in 2025, it has arguably been immigration. Even when the debate isn't about immigration itself and the conversation is about the economy, pensions, or foreign policy, those conversations have a proclivity to be in the context of immigration. That's just how impactful and disruptive migration is. And the people driving this political realignment aren't primarily motivated by abstract economic theories. They're motivated by the concrete experience of watching their neighborhoods, their cultures, and their sense of safety change faster than any democratic process they participated in ever authorized. Now, here's where the Western culturist lens becomes essential. Because if you want to understand what's actually happening in Europe right now, you don't look to the talking heads on CNN or BBC or the academic papers on inequality. You look to Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French observer of democratic civilization, who warned in the 19th century that the greatest threat to free societies isn't external tyranny, it's the gradual erosion of the civic associations, cultural identities, and shared values that hold a people together as a people. When those erode, the democratic citizen doesn't become more free. They become more anxious, more atomized, and more susceptible to the kind of demagogic politics that genuine cultural confidence would inoculate against. What you're watching in Europe is a population that was told for 3 decades that their cultural identity was provincial, their attachment to their nations was retrograde, and the future belonged to a borderless, post national, technocratically administered European project. And for 3 decades, they mostly went along with it until the reality set in, until the gap between what the government class told them was happening and what they could see with their own eyes in their own streets became too large to bridge with ideology. And then they started voting the way people vote when they feel that nobody in the established political system represents them loudly, defiantly, and in numbers that no one predicted. The Roman historian Livy wrote about the concept of virtues, the civic virtue and moral fiber that made Rome great and whose erosion preceded every period of Roman decline. What the European establishment is experiencing right now is a population reasserting its virtues, its collective sense that a people has both the right and the responsibility to define its own culture, govern its own borders, and pass its own civilization intact down to the next generation. You can agree or disagree with the specific policies being advocated, but the underlying impulse that a civilization is worth defending and that its people have the authority to defend it is not extremism. It's one of the oldest and most legitimate expressions of political self determination in the Western tradition, and it's entirely necessary for the survival of Western culture. All right. Now, let's take a step back and look at some fascinating news that's unrelated to politics because genuinely good news doesn't often pop up on the public radar. In a remarkable deep sea breakthrough announced this week, researchers have discovered 24 new species of amphipods in the Pacific Ocean's Clarion Clipperton zone, including a rare, entirely new superfamily, a previously unknown branch of life. And let me put that into perspective. We're not talking about finding a new beetle in the rainforest or a new subspecies of bird. A new superfamily is a fundamental new branch of the tree of life, a category of creatures so distinct from everything we've previously cataloged that it requires an entirely new classification above the family level. Scientists estimate we've cataloged roughly around 15 to 20% of the species on Earth. The deep ocean remains one of the least explored environments on the planet, and discoveries like this remind us that the world is still vast, still largely unknown, and still capable of profound surprises. This matters beyond the immediate scientific excitement, and here's how it connects to everything we've talked about on this show. One of the core convictions of Western civilization, rooted in both the Christian tradition and the Enlightenment scientific project, is that the natural world is ordered, intelligible, and endlessly worth understanding. The mandate in Genesis to have dominion over the earth has always carried within it the responsibility of stewardship, to know, to understand, and to care for creation rather than simply exploiting it or ignoring it. Every time a scientist descends into the deep ocean and comes back with evidence of life we never knew existed, they are participating in the ancient project of understanding the created order. And every new species discovered is a reminder that the universe is more generous, more complex, and more astonishing than our current understanding can grasp. That's certainly worth celebrating loudly and without apology, and we should always prioritize exploring the world in which we live and the universe of which we know so little. Now, let's tie everything together because the European political story we covered in our news segment isn't just interesting current events. It's a living demonstration of principles that the Western philosophical and historical tradition has been articulating for over 2,000 years. The first principle is one we've touched on in previous episodes, but it deserves direct statement here. A civilization is not an accident, it's an achievement. The specific combination of ideas, institutions, values, and practices that produced Western civilization, like individual liberty, the rule of law, the presumption of human dignity rooted in the imago Dei, the separation of church and state, the scientific method, free markets, and constitutional government, didn't emerge spontaneously from the soil. They were built, argued over, fought for, refined across centuries, and transmitted deliberately from one generation to the next through education, culture, religion, and civic life. And like every achievement, they can be lost. They require active maintenance, conscious defense, and the willingness of each generation to understand what they've inherited well enough to pass it on. Edmund Burke, the great Anglo Irish statesman who is often called the father of modern conservatism, articulated this in terms that feels startlingly applicable to the European moment right now. Society, Burke argued, is not a contract between the living alone. It's a partnership between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. Each generation holds civilization in trust. They didn't create it, they inherited it, and their obligation is to transmit it intact and, if possible, improved to the generations that follow. When a political class decides that the civilizational inheritance of the people it governs is an obstacle to its ideological vision rather than a sacred trust, it isn't being progressive, it's being unfaithful to the deepest obligation of governance. This is what millions of Europeans have sensed, even when they couldn't articulate it in Burke's terms. They've sensed that something was being done to their civilization without their consent and without their participation in the decision. That the things that made their countries, the language, the customs, the religious heritage, the civic traditions, the unspoken shared assumptions that make people a people rather than just a collection of economic units inhabiting the same geography, were being treated as obstacles to be managed rather than treasures to be preserved. And they've responded in the way people do when they feel their inheritance is being taken from them. They've fought back. And while this process is imperfect and messy, with candidates sometimes carrying baggage and flaws, as is human nature, the underlying impulse of preservation is civilizationally legitimate. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that a man's first duty is to the whole of which he is a part. For Marcus, that whole was the Roman Empire and the broader human community governed by the rational order of the Logos. But this principle applies at every level of human association, such as the family, community, nation, and civilization. We are not isolated individuals floating free of any obligation to the communities that formed us. We are constituted by those communities. Our language, our moral institutions, our sense of beauty and justice, our capacity for the kind of relationship that makes a full human life possible. All of these come to us through a particular civilizational inheritance we are born into. Refusal to defend that inheritance isn't cosmopolitan enlightenment. It's ingratitude towards the people and the ideas and the sacrifices that made us who we are. Now, here's the nuance that the Western culturist framework demands we hold simultaneously. Defending a civilization is not the same as closing it off. The Western tradition, at its best, has always been capable of confident openness. The willingness to engage with, learn from, and even integrate what is genuinely good from other traditions while maintaining the core commitments that make Western civilization what it is. Rome was remarkably good at this for centuries. The medieval church synthesized Greek philosophy with Christian theology precisely because it was confident enough in its own tradition to engage with something foreign without being threatened by it. The Enlightenment itself was a product of Western civilization's willingness to question its own assumptions while maintaining its commitment to reason and human dignity as the ground of that questioning. The problem with the open borders ideology that has governed European politics for the past 3 decades isn't that it welcomed people from other cultures, it's that it did so without any serious framework for the culture transmission and integration that genuine civilizational confidence requires. It treated the arrival of tens of millions of people from fundamentally different cultural, religious, and political traditions as not only a purely logistical challenge, but as an inherently enriching good, while dismissing any concern about cultural cohesion as racism. And in doing so, it undermined the very confidence that would have made genuine integration possible. A civilization that isn't sure its own values are worth defending can't ask anyone to adopt them. And a political class that treats its own people's attachment to their culture as a problem to be managed rather than a strength to be honored has forfeited its moral authority to lead. What the European right wing surge represents at its best, beneath the messy political reality of specific parties, candidates, and platforms, is a people remembering that they have a civilization worth defending. That's not a threat to human dignity, that's one of the preconditions for it. Because human dignity, in Western tradition, isn't an abstract universal principle floating free of any cultural context. It was built in specific places, by specific people, through specific institutions, over specific centuries. And the people who built it and who inherited it have both the right and the responsibility to say so. The immigrant question isn't a matter of isolation or racial purity. It is about preserving the Western culture through a calculated and calibrated filtering process, wherein those who are able to assimilate and champion Western ideals are welcome to remain, and those who cannot must be removed for the preservation of Western culture and the well being of those living within it. In closing, the main takeaway from this episode is that we are witnessing the entire European continent begin to reassert their civilizational identity in real time as they reject the progressive, rules based post civilization world order. But don't forget, in the hustle and bustle of the 21st century lifestyle, remain curious and in wonder of creation. We still know so little about our own planet, let alone the universe, and we are given dominion over it. The 24 new branches of life discovered in the deep ocean are just a reminder of the astonishing generosity of creation and the Western tradition's enduring pursuit to better understand our Creator through the discovery of His works while on our journey. If this episode gave you something worth thinking about, share it. Not for the metrics, but because the framework we're building here, The ability to look at current events and see its civilizational depth rather than just its political surface is exactly what's missing from most of the conversation happening right now. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content, and we'll see you next time. God bless.